All right, so we're going to talk about producer surplus, total surplus, and deadweight loss in a market equilibrium scenario. So first off, we've already talked about consumer surplus, right? And we said that was the dollar value gain to consumers from having access to a particular product at a particular price, right? So it's the summation of the difference between what we're willing to pay and what we have to pay for the products that are consumed. Right? And one point to make here is that, yes, these are gains, these are benefits to consumers, but these are not coming necessarily at the expense of suppliers, right? That just because consumers are winning doesn't mean sellers or suppliers are losing. The whole idea of a market interaction is that it's a mutually beneficial exchange. No one would ever purchase a product unless that voluntary transaction made them better off. Likewise, a supplier wouldn't be selling that product if it didn't make them better off as well. So for every transaction, there's going to be a consumer surplus, a net gain to the buyer, and a producer surplus, a net gain to the buyer. Right? And the simple idea is, as long as we can have a negotiated price that lies somewhere between the maximum willingness to pay of the consumer and the cost of production, the marginal cost for that unit of the seller, both sides are going to be better off. Now, where on that spectrum the price ends up will tell us who has more gains or losses. But again, the point is there are going to be net gains to both sides under this condition, right, where the price lies between marginal cost and willingness to pay. So once again, what we've already seen, the gap between willingness to pay and price, right, summed up across all transactions that occur, that represents that net benefit, the gains from trade going to the consumer or the buyer. That's our consumer surplus. Well, all we need to think about is the gap in the other direction, right? How far above the marginal cost the price is, that's going to be the net gain per unit to the seller, and that's going to be our producer surplus. Right? So the difference between price and marginal cost summed across all transactions. That'll be our PS, or producer surplus definition. And note, this would be summed across all transactions for a particular producer and summed across all producers, right? So it's an idea of getting a total social value of producing a product at a particular price. So just a real quick, simple example here. Imagine we have a supply schedule that looks like this, and notice we've kind of broken up the quantity column here into these little segments, right? And imagine whatever the case is, these are cups of coffee being produced per hour. For every unit between 0 and 10, the cost of production is 50 cents, right? And again, the numbers don't really matter, but for every supply process, right, at some point, as you increase production, you're going to need to increase the use of less and less efficient resources, and those costs per unit are going to rise. So with that next increment from 11 units, 11 to 20, the cost per unit jumps up to $1. Add another 10 units, that next segment goes up another 50 cents, and so on, right? So again, we're doing this just to make the diagram a little bit easier to see in terms of those gaps between price and marginal cost, but it conforms to the law of supply, right? As quantity increases, marginal cost increases as well. So we're going to get this little stepwise diagram of a supply curve. So it's not a curve, right? And it's not even a line, but it's a supply relationship, right? Every 10 units we go over, we go 50 cents up. So now, just for the sake of argument, imagine that the equilibrium price is $2, right? So what the seller is going to do, right, is decide, okay, how many units am I going to want to produce and sell at that price of $2? And as always, we're going to go where the intersection between the supply relationship and price is found. And that's going to be here. Right? And in making that decision, they're also essentially calculating their producer surplus, right? The gap between price and marginal cost, right, for each unit. And that's what we would calculate, right? So for the first 10 units, I'm going to take this little rectangle here. We've got a price of $2. Each unit costs us 50 cents. So we're gaining $1.50, right, per unit times 10 units. So that'll be $15 for this little chunk here. Each one of these rectangles, right? Each 50 cents gap between price and marginal cost times $10. Each one of those little rectangles is a $5 value, essentially, to the supplier, right? And then they keep going. They increase output up to 20. So for each of these, right, there is a $1 gap times 10 units. So they get two of those little $5 rectangles. So it's price minus marginal cost for each of those units produced. So that's going to be another $10. You see where this is going, right? And we keep producing and we're still gaining, right? But of course, marginal cost is catching up to price. So that net gain is going to be smaller. Price minus marginal cost here is only 50 cents. 2 minus 150, 50 cents for each of those 10 units. So we get that extra $10. I'm sorry, extra $5. And then finally, if we decide to produce those last 10 units at the intersection with between price and supply, price and marginal cost are the same. So we get no gain on those last units. We would break even. So we add all that up and we get a total of $30. And that would represent the gain from trade, right? The net benefit to the seller of producing those 40 units and selling them at the going rate of $2. Okay. In general, right, all we're doing when we calculate producer surplus is going to be kind of the geometry problem, right? Just as we saw with consumer surplus, it's an area in that price quantity space. Here it's going to be the area under the price, above the cost curve, above the supply curve, out to the quantity sold. Now, generally, right, our supply curves are not going to be these stepwise functions, and we're not going to have the little rectangles to add up. So we would simply calculate the area of the triangle denoted by or bounded by the supply curve price and quantity, right? So if we imagine a market supply with the same scenario, so there's 100 coffee shops operating with the same supply schedule, instead of 40 units produced, it would be 4,000 at the price of $2. And again, imagining the initial marginal cost here is at 50 cents again. So we would simply use the 1/2 base times height formula for the area of a triangle. So 1/2 times quantity, 4,000, times the gap, the maximum gap between price and marginal cost, the height of the triangle, of $1.50. Do a little calculation. I think that comes out to be 3,000, right? And again, be able to put that into a sentence, right? What does that producer surplus of $3,000 represent? It's the net gain to suppliers from having access to this market at that price. Now, just as we saw with consumers, of course, the dollar value of net gain is going to be highly dependent on the price at which we can sell our product, right? And it should make perfect sense that as the price rises, that's going to be good news for the seller. Producer surplus is going to rise as well. So if we make that little adjustment to our diagram, imagine we start at price level P1, which gave us an area of producer surplus represented by area A here. And then the price goes up to P2. Law of supply is going to kick in, right? We're going to move up along our supply line here. and increase output from Q1 to Q2. And of course, what we're doing is adding area under price above the supply curve. And just to disentangle that, right, this rectangle area B represents the gain to the producer of being able to sell all the units that they were already selling out to Q1 for a higher price. Right? So this is just an increase in the gap between price and cost by this value. So that's one reason that we're happy from the producer's point of view that price is going up, selling what we were already selling for a higher price, a bigger net gain. The other thing that's happening, of course, is we're selling more units, and each of those units right up until that break-even intersection point is going to have a positive gap between price and marginal cost. So that area C represents the increased surplus, price minus marginal cost, on all of those additional units sold, moving up along the supply curve from Q1 to Q2. Price giveth, price taketh away, right? So if the price falls, of course, all of that's going to evaporate. So just turn all that around. Imagine we start at price level P1. So all of that area A, B, and C represented producer surplus. But when the price comes down, we're going to go right back in the other direction, decreasing our quantity supplied. And of course, the area under the new price above our supply curve is just going to be area A. And we should be able to, right, attribute the losses to one of those two things. It's either area B, which is the lost benefit because of the lower price on, right, the units that we are still selling out to Q2, as opposed to area C, which represents the loss on the units that we're no longer producing. Right? We can't have a surplus on units that were not being sold. Right? So area B, the change in price, area C from the change in quantity. In both cases, just the direction is going to be different. One other thing to kind of think about here is when we think about producer surplus for the market as a whole, right? So we're measuring that area under the price above the supply curve for the entire market supply, is that we can kind of think of that supply curve as representing different firms, right? Imagine that we lined up all the firms producing whatever, all the coffee shops, and we lined them up sorted by how efficient they are, sorted by their marginal cost, right? Then as you go from left to right, you're getting less and less efficient. The costs are rising. So we can kind of imagine, we can pick 2 points, right? So imagine the coffee shop here, say that's producing the 2,000th cup of coffee in a given hour in a given locality. Well, clearly their producer surplus for that unit produced is going to be different from any other firm, right? They're going to be exacting this distance, right, between their marginal costs, say $1 per cup, and the price they can sell it at, the $2 for that marginal unit. That's going to have a $1 net gain, a $1 contribution to total producer surplus. But what about the poor firm that's out here, right? Maybe they're not quite so efficient, or maybe they're operating at the extreme end of their marginal cost curve. Whoever's producing that 4,000th unit, they're just breaking even. They're getting zero producer surplus on that unit. Right? So again, the point is producer surplus is an aggregated value, right? It's summed up across all the firms that are producing a product, and it's not equally distributed, right? We're clearly going to have an incentive to be the most efficient producer of a product. That's going to be the profit maximizing outcome, which is also going to be the producer surplus maximizing outcome, right? So producer surplus, yes, it depends on the price at which the product is sold, but it also depends on, right, the attributes of an individual firm, where they lie on that market supply curve. And while we're bringing up that topic of profit maximization, it's real easy to kind of think of producer surplus as synonymous with profit, right? They're definitely related, but we want to make sure we keep those as separate ideas, right? And we'll get into the nitty gritty details of what exactly do we mean by profit and profit maximization coming up very soon. But for now, just kind of the simple definition of a firm's level of profit, right? It's their total revenue coming in minus their total expenses, their total costs. And producer surplus, yes, it accounts for the difference between revenue per unit, price, and cost per unit, marginal cost, the height of the supply curve. It doesn't include all of the costs, right? All we're calculating there is the marginal cost, right? How much does it cost me extra to produce that one additional unit? And if I can sell it for a higher price, then I'm going to earn that additional value. So we can think of producer surplus as representing the summation of all of the marginal profits, right? The gain from doing that one extra thing, producing that one extra unit. But the key is what's missing from that calculation are all of what we will call the fixed costs. Things like, right, the rent that you have to pay on the coffee shop, right, the interest that you pay on the loan to purchase all the capital equipment for your production. Whether you produce a lot or a little or none, you still got to pay the rent. You still got to pay the bank the interest payments, right? So those are going to be there eating away at your profit. They're going to be subtracted off here, but they don't show up in those marginal calculations that are in the producer surplus. So again, we're going to get into the details of that later on. The point now is keep those as separate ideas. Very much related, producer surplus and profit, but not exactly the same thing. So when we're calculating a number for producer surplus, we don't want to say, oh, this is the total profit earned by an industry or a firm. Okay, different deals. Okay, so now we've got consumer surplus. We've got that locked down, defined. We know how to show it on a diagram. We've got producer surplus locked down, defined. We know how to calculate it, show it on a diagram, and interpret its value. We put those two things together, and we get what we call our total surplus, TS. And that's going to have a very useful and particular interpretation. The sum total of the net gain to consumers plus the net gain to producers, we're going to say represents the total social value, the gains to society of having access to a specific market. So obviously we have a very limited definition of society. It's the consumers and producers of that particular product. But the assumption that we're making, that we will definitely violate later on when we look at kind of more realistic cases, is that when we're thinking about the value added to society of a particular market, well, the only people that get the benefits, right, and bear the costs are the consumers and producers. So how much does society gain from having access to local coffee shops? It's the total dollar value of consumer gain plus producer gain. And that dollar value, right, is going to be a really useful benchmark when we start to think about changes in a market, right? What happens when prices go up or down, or quantities go up or down, or where we're leading with this, a government intervenes in a market equilibrium. How much is that change, whatever it is, going to cost society? Well, it's going to be how much does the sum of consumer and producer surplus change? The other thing to note, just kind of at this basic point here, is that when we add up, when we start to measure value, right, by the sum total of consumer and producer surplus, and all we care about is this total area, right, that contains both of our special little triangles, CS and PS, well, we're no longer really concerned about how much is going to the consumer, how much is going to the producer, right? We can redistribute that any way we want within that overall area, and it doesn't really matter. It's the total social value. And that's kind of how we want to start to think about this. Yes, we'll also be tracking winners and losers when interventions, when policies are enacted. But from a social welfare standpoint, our goal really is to maximize total surplus. And luckily, we've already kind of shown it with the geometry. No combination of price and quantity that we can find is going to give us a higher level of total surplus than market equilibrium. Right? So this goes back to the idea that a market equilibrium, when left to its own devices, will give us the most efficient social welfare maximizing outcome. The much more succinct way to say that is simply equilibrium maximizes total surplus. And the flip side of that is any deviation from equilibrium is going to give us by geometric definition, is going to give us a smaller area between the demand curve and the supply curve. And again, a change from equilibrium might be beneficial to consumers. It might be beneficial to producers, but the net effect is always going to be negative, right? The losses are always going to be greater than the gains. And we can see kind of the only two options, right? From a change from equilibrium is if quantity goes down or quantity goes up. Right? So think about what's happening at quantity level Q1. This one's pretty straightforward, right? At quantity level Q1, area A is all we get for consumer surplus, right? The area under the demand curve above the price out to the quantity sold. Well, we have to stop here at Q1. So we've lost area C. We're no longer able to consume those units, so there's no surplus, no net gain available. Same thing's happening with producer surplus, right? The area above the supply curve, below the price, out to the quantity traded. Well, that's going to be curtailed here at Q1. So the producer surplus at Q1 is just area B, not the whole area. We've lost area D, just like we saw before, right? Due to a change in quantity, that little triangle of lost surplus, lost potential gains. The one that's a little bit trickier to see is, and I don't say never, but it happens much less frequently. What if some intervention, some policy occurs that forces a market to produce and sell a quantity greater than equilibrium? And here, it doesn't matter what the price level is, but just imagine it stays at that equilibrium. We actually end up having negative surplus values, right? So think about what area E represents here. It's this area, right, where the marginal cost is above the price for every unit sold, right? So we're somehow forcing producers to sell a product for a price less than it costs them to produce it. So they're losing money, right? They have a negative marginal profit, and the contribution of those units to producer surplus is going to be negative. And likewise for consumers, we're going to have a price greater than willingness to pay between QE and Q2, right? And what does that mean? A negative contribution to consumer surplus. And again, note that it doesn't matter where we put the price. There is no longer a mutually beneficial negotiable price at a quantity beyond QE. If we raise the price, lower the price, it just means one side's losing more and the other side is losing less. But there's always going to be this negative contribution to total surplus. So it doesn't matter what direction we go, society loses from a disequilibrium. So the particular terminology that we're going to place on that is so-called deadweight loss, the DWL. And that's the dollar value of lost potential gains from trade meaning total surplus, due to a disequilibrium. So it's tracking how much society loses in dollar terms from a policy and intervention that pushes us away from equilibrium. And again, the basic idea, equilibrium maximizes total surplus. Any government intervention, price ceilings, price floors, subsidies, taxes, quotas, tariffs, all of those are going to push us away from an equilibrium and by definition reduce our total surplus. Again, it's just a matter of the geometry, right? And therefore have a deadweight loss associated with it. So what is going to come next is going through the particulars of those individual policies, right? We've already seen it on a graph, what it looks like to have a price ceiling or a price floor. Now we can track who's winning, who's losing, and by how much, and the total social cost of those policies just by tracking consumer and producer surplus. We'll add on top of that the intervention of per unit or excise taxation, basically what we have with sales taxes, and see that the result is going to be very, very similar. So that's all coming up. Stay tuned. Thanks.